Yo guys, so today we get to cross off a bucket list item. We're gonna go skiing for the very first time, all while testing out Sony's brand new lens, the 16mm f1.8G. What do we say to that?
Yes, Daddy!
Oh, let's go! Look at that snow! Very good in that. So in today's video, we're gonna take a look at the brand new Sony 16mm f1.8G lens. We'll take a look at the image quality through some technical tests, as well as look at some sample photos and videos. We'll look at how well it handles things like autofocus. We'll also take a look at the build quality, and we'll even compare it against the Viltrox 16mm f1.8. As a quick disclosure, Sony did loan me this lens to test and review before its launch, but Sony is not sponsoring this video and they don't get to review this video before it gets posted. And as always, all of my opinions are my own. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Sharpness is almost always the first thing I check, and this lens performs quite well. Center sharpness, even wide open at f1.8, is tack sharp, and it's consistently sharp as you stop down to f2.8, f4, and f5.6. The corners, however, were a little surprising, showing that wide open at f1.8, it's a little soft. This improves, however, as you stop down to f2.8, f4, and f5.6, with each stop bringing a little more sharpness to the edges. In real-world scenarios, the same looks to be true. When wide open at f1.8, centers perform remarkably well, while the corners are a little soft. This, of course, can be fixed by stopping down your lens to get a sharper and more in-focus image, but I thought that this was worth pointing out. When it comes to lens flares, this lens does a really good job handling the actual flaring, being able to maintain contrast throughout the frame without getting washed out by lens flares. But you can see that there's definitely a decent amount of ghosting still present depending on how the light source hits the lens. Another quality I like to look at with new lenses is going to be the bokeh, or the out of focus element, and how well it renders it. And shockingly, this lens does a really good job at creating smooth backgrounds even though it's a wide angled lens. Bokeh elements in photos are rendered very smoothly and doesn't distract from the image as a whole. This is paired exceptionally well with the impressive close focus performance of this lens, which we'll talk about later, to create a lot more depth than you'd expect out of a non-macro lens. Bokeh balls are also rendered nice and round without any distracting artifacts as well. Now, let's talk about how this lens handles typical artifacts like vignetting, chromatic aberration, and distortion. Starting with vignetting, there's a mild amount of light loss in the corners happening when wide open at f1.8 as expected, but that completely goes away as you stop down to f2.8, and there's basically no further improvement past that even as you stop down to like f4. This lens also handles chromatic aberration really well. Wide open at f1.8, I see very minor amounts of purple and bluish fringing at the focal plane, but only when I'm zoomed all the way in. The lens performs similarly at handling chromatic aberration even as you stop down to f2.8 and further to f4. When it comes to distortion control, we can see that there's some pincushion distortion happening. When I take a step back to take this picture again, you can see it a little clearer in the top and bottom of the test chart board. For a 16mm focal length, I was expecting some amount of distortion, and at this amount, I think it's pretty minor. Alright, so let's talk about some focus related topics and tests. For photography, the autofocus was really sticky and fast. This is very consistent with basically all of the other Sony G and G Master lenses that I've tested in recent memory. And the story's basically the same when it comes to video autofocus as well. And while we're here, let's go ahead and put that to the test. Currently on the Sony ZV-E1, I have autofocus transition speed set to 7, the fastest, and its autofocus subject shift to 5, which is the most responsive. And we're gonna go ahead and see how well the autofocus tracking does. Let's give it a shot. How did that do? This lens excels in focus in two other ways as well. First of which is the lens's minimum focusing distance of 6 inches when using autofocus, and as close as 5 inches when using manual focus. That's insanely close to the lens, and at that distance you also get some really deep bokeh as well. The second way this lens excels in focus is its lack of focus breathing. With Sony's in-body focus breathing compensation turned on, focus breathing on this lens is basically non-existent, giving you those perfect focus pulls without the edges of your shot zooming in and out. You know what's better than fast autofocus? Fast internet. Which makes me appreciate our sponsor, Frontier Fiber Internet, even more. In our house, I create content online and my wife often works from home, so we're online all day. So speed, it's non-negotiable. Fiber optics uses beams of light through thin glass strands to get crazy fast 5 gigabit per second download and upload speeds. For me, fast symmetrical download and upload speeds means that I can transfer files to my clients and upload videos to YouTube and social platforms like that. And for Annette, that means she can get fast access to remote files in the cloud and always have crystal clear video calls. Frontier Fiber supercharges your internet so you can work, live, and play the way you want. If you're interested, check out the links in the description down below to learn more and get an exclusive offer from Frontier you can only get here. Thanks again to Frontier for sponsoring this segment of this video. So far, after shooting with this lens for about 2 weeks now, I feel like this lens excels in basically everything you'd use it for. Flying it on a gimbal is extremely satisfying because of that field of view, you're able to kind of get these really dynamic shots that really put you in the scene with your subjects. And on top of that, I feel like this lens would be really great for real estate work, landscape work, architecture, and vlogging, as you can tell, thanks to that wide focal length. Right now, I'm using the Sony ZV-E1's active stabilization, which zooms in at about 20% and gives you that stabilized footage. But we can take it a step further to get even more stable footage by switching it to dynamic active stabilization, which is only available on the Sony ZV-E1 right now, which crops in about 50%, but gives you much more stable handheld footage. And with that 16mm cropped in 50%, that gives you 24mm. It's basically just wide enough to get this vlogging field of view with your arms about fully outstretched. And I feel like it looks pretty good, and I feel like this is one thing that this lens does really well with. Now, let's take a look at the build quality of this lens. The Sony 16mm f1.8G looks like every other G-series lens in Sony's contemporary lineup, so it should feel really familiar. You've got solid construction with a smooth focus ring, you've got an aperture ring that goes from f1.8 all the way up to f22, and an automatic mode if you want to control your aperture in camera. There's also a click-declick switch for your aperture ring depending on if you prefer tactile stops or a continuous smooth rotation. There's an iris lock switch, an autofocus manual focus switch, and a custom programmable button as well. On the lens mount, you'll find a thin rubber gasket for weather sealing, and on the front end of the lens, you'll find a 67mm filter thread, which is in line with a bunch of other Sony lenses, which is pretty sweet. The most impressive part of this lens is honestly its size and weight, with it being small enough to fit in the palm of my hand and only weighing 2/3 of a pound or 304 grams. So let's talk about price and how well it stacks up against the Viltrox 16mm f1.8 lens. When the Viltrox 16mm came out, I was so stoked about it because it filled such a gap in Sony's full-frame lens lineup. Specifically, it was a wide-angle full-frame lens with a wide f1.8 aperture with autofocus, and it was budget-friendly, coming in at $580. But now we've got the native Sony 16mm f1.8G lens, which has the same specs on paper and comes in at just $799. So my first question was, is this Sony lens worth the $220 more expensive price tag? Well, if you're just looking for image quality comparisons, the Viltrox holds up surprisingly well, but there is definitely a difference. First of all, you can see here that both lenses are sharp, but the Sony lens renders colors a bit more true to life, while the Viltrox lens tends to have a slight warm cast. On top of that, the bokeh rendition also leans in favor of the Sony, as the Sony's out of focus area just looks smoother and less busy. Plus, the Sony's minimum focus distance is 6 inches, while the Viltrox's minimum focus distance is around 10.5 inches. And that's all without addressing the fact that the Sony 16mm f1.8 is significantly smaller than the Viltrox 16mm f1.8, and it's almost half as light. Altogether, for me, it just makes more sense to save up that extra $200 to spring for the native Sony lens, as opposed to try to save a little bit of money and go with the Viltrox lens, because really the Sony lens does just about everything better except for price. If you're interested in checking out the new Sony 16mm f1.8G lens, I'll leave links in the description down below. Personally, I think that the Sony 16mm f1.8G lens is a really interesting option, and it's really made its way all the way up to the top of my short list of lenses that I need to pick up. For me, the small size and lightweight design of the Sony lens makes it really attractive because it makes it super easy to throw into your camera bag to bring with you on personal vacations, on trips, on content trips, because it doesn't take up a lot of space, it's super light, so if I don't use it that day, I don't feel like I just carried around a bunch of weight for no reason. It's gonna be great for travel vlogging, it's gonna be fun to use on gimbals for those wide, fast-moving shots to add that kinetic energy into your videos, plus it's gonna be so useful for when I'm doing event videography and for when I'm shooting weddings. Let me know in the comments section down below on what you guys would use this lens for, or if there's anything I missed on covering this lens. Alright, that's it for this one. Don't forget to get subscribed if you're interested in seeing more coverage of the latest Sony camera gear, and as always, I will see you in the next one. Peace.